Someone out there is not just thinking about you. They are emotionally tangled in you in a way they cannot explain. And the strangest part is, they don't even fully understand why. It didn't happen because you tried. It didn't happen because of something obvious you did. It happened because you unknowingly activated something inside them they were never prepared to face. And if you've ever felt that strange shift, where someone's energy toward you feels too intense, too inconsistent, or too emotionally charged to be normal, then you're already inside this psychological pattern without realizing it. Someone is deeply in love with you, and the reason behind it will disturb you more than it comforts you, because it has almost nothing to do with who you believe you are. Instead, it has everything to do with what you unintentionally awakened inside them without even trying. Once you truly see this pattern, it becomes something you cannot unsee again. You tend to think love is built on attraction, shared interests, compatibility, or timing. But that belief is mostly comforting rather than fully true. The mind prefers simple explanations, yet real emotional depth often works in a very different way. What looks like love on the surface is sometimes something much deeper, something that begins quietly in the unconscious layers of the mind. Most people are taught to believe love is something logical, or at least understandable. Attraction, shared values, emotional safety, or perfect timing are often seen as the foundation. But this idea is more comforting than accurate, because comfort helps the mind avoid uncomfortable truths. Real obsessive or irrational forms of love rarely begin in logic. They begin in hidden psychological spaces where awareness is limited. Without realizing it, you stepped into a part of someone's inner world that they may have kept buried for years. This is not something planned or controlled. It simply happens when someone represents something emotionally deeper than what they consciously understand. What you did without intention was not just make them feel good or appreciated. You made them feel seen in a way that quietly unsettled them inside. Being seen at that level is not always peaceful for someone. In fact, it can feel disturbing because it touches parts of them they usually avoid. This is where things begin to shift emotionally. When someone feels seen so deeply, they do not just admire you from a distance anymore. Instead, they start attaching to you in a stronger, more intense way that feels difficult to control or even explain properly to themselves. Most people misunderstand this kind of emotional response because they assume being loved simply means being liked or appreciated. But what is happening here goes far deeper than that simple understanding. It is not just affection forming, it is recognition being triggered. Something inside them, which may have been buried or suppressed for a long time, starts responding to you. This recognition is not fully conscious. It feels emotional, instinctive, and overwhelming. You become the point where hidden emotions begin to surface, even if the person does not fully understand what is happening within them. At some point, you stop being just another person in their life and start becoming a kind of mirror. This does not happen because you are trying to reflect anything, but because of how naturally you exist in their perception. You represent something they did not expect, something they cannot easily define or control. That lack of control creates emotional tension. Their inner structure, which is built to protect them from certain feelings or truths, begins to feel challenged. And when that structure weakens, emotions that were once controlled begin to rise in unpredictable ways. Inside them, there are emotional layers that were never meant to be fully confronted. These include hidden desires, suppressed needs, and avoided truths about themselves. Their mind is usually organized to keep these parts contained and distant, but your presence disrupts that balance. You do not do it intentionally, yet your effect becomes powerful enough to break through those internal boundaries. When that happens, their emotional system starts reacting differently because the usual protections are no longer working the same way they used to.
What they feel for you is not simple or clean. It is not fully conscious either, and it cannot be easily explained in logical terms. Instead, it becomes a mixture of longing, fear, emotional projection, and something very close to obsession. These emotions overlap and blend together in a confusing way. You are not just someone they are attracted to, you are someone who has disrupted their inner emotional world.
And when disruption happens in the unconscious mind, it often feels like something meaningful or even destined, even when it is deeply confusing. What makes you so powerful in their perception is not something obvious you did or said. You did not follow a formula or perform in a specific way. Instead, you broke an expectation they did not even know they had. The human mind depends heavily on patterns because patterns feel safe and predictable. When something breaks those patterns in a meaningful way, it creates strong psychological impact. You became that unexpected element, not chaotic, but deeply noticeable in a way that stayed in their mind. Because of this, their mind started to assign meaning to you beyond your actual identity. This is where projection begins. They stop seeing you only as a real person with normal traits and start seeing you as something symbolic. You become an answer to something internal they cannot fully explain. It is as if you represent a solution to an emotional question they never consciously formed. In this stage, they are not only reacting to you, they are also reacting to what you now represent inside their psychological world. Once this shift happens, the attachment changes completely. They are no longer just falling in love with you in a normal sense. Instead, they are falling into the emotional space you now occupy in their mind. This creates a deep form of attachment that is very hard to break. Because leaving you emotionally would not only mean distance from a person, it would also mean facing the internal feelings and realizations that you unintentionally awakened in them. That is why detachment becomes extremely difficult for them. So instead of letting go, they tend to hold on even more tightly, even when it does not make sense logically. This holding on can feel confusing, inconsistent, or even painful for them. Yet they continue because something inside them feels unresolved. However, what is important to understand is that this process is not purely beautiful. You did not only awaken admiration or emotional clarity, you also awakened instability, because emotions that were suppressed for a long time do not return gently or in an organized way. When suppressed emotions begin to surface, they rarely come out in a controlled form. Instead, they can erupt and distort how a person sees reality. Boundaries can feel unclear, and emotional intensity can feel like absolute truth, even when it is not fully grounded. This is why the experience becomes so confusing for both sides. What feels deeply meaningful may also be emotionally distorted at the same time. And even if they do not express it clearly, you can often sense that something intense is happening underneath their behavior. There is often a strange tension in how they look at you or react around you, even when nothing obvious is being said. It feels like something unspoken is always present in the space between you. But the complexity increases because they themselves do not fully understand what they are experiencing. This is not happening in their conscious awareness. It is happening in deeper layers of their mind, where logic does not operate in the same way. In that space, love and fear can exist together without clear separation, which is why their behavior often feels inconsistent or unstable. One moment, they feel extremely drawn to you, as if something in them is pulled forward without effort or reason. The next moment, they pull away, not because the feeling has disappeared, but because their internal defense system suddenly activates. Something inside them reacts with caution, whispering that this is too much, that this is exposing something they are not prepared to confront. And this is how the loop begins, an unconscious cycle of push and pull that they themselves cannot fully control. Desire appears, then fear follows. Closeness is replaced by distance. Intensity turns into confusion, and without realizing it, you become part of this emotional cycle as well, whether you intended to or not. Because there is a part of you that feels it too. This connection does not feel ordinary. It feels heavier, more charged, as if it is pulling something out of you that you did not expect to surface. And this is where the real question quietly begins to form. What exactly happened to create something this strong between you and them? It was not random, it was not pure chance, and it was not something meaningless. There was a moment, a very specific internal shift, where something in them recognized you in a way that went beyond conscious thought. And once that recognition took place, there was no simple return to how things were before. But what most people fail to understand is that this recognition was never about your surface identity.
It was not about your appearance, your words, or your actions alone. It was about what you represent within their unconscious mind. And what you represent is something layered, something complex, something they have been both searching for and avoiding at the same time. This is exactly why they cannot easily let go, and why everything feels so intense, so emotionally confusing, and so difficult to define in clear terms. Because what was activated is not simple attraction, but something much deeper that has been buried for a long time. In truth, you did not simply make them fall in love in a normal sense. You activated something within them that had been suppressed for years, possibly even for most of their life. And once something like that is awakened, it does not return to sleep easily. It remains active in the background of their mind. It continues to grow quietly, it builds pressure over time, and eventually it pushes toward confrontation.
But the real uncertainty is not about what you triggered. It is about what they will do when they can no longer avoid it. Will they face it directly, or will they try to escape it while losing parts of themselves in the process? At first, they may have convinced themselves that it meant nothing, just a passing feeling, a temporary fascination, something that would naturally fade with distance and time. But time did not erase it. Instead, it deepened it. Because what they are experiencing is not surface-level attraction. It is rooted in something much older, something that existed in them long before you entered their life, something buried in the unconscious layers of memory and emotion. And the unconscious does not forget in the way the conscious mind does. It stores, it waits, and it reactivates when something external touches the right emotional point. And somehow, without planning it, you became that point. You entered their life not just as a person, but as a trigger, a psychological key that unlocked something they had been holding back for a long time. Something they may not even have fully known existed within them. And this is where things become dangerous in a subtle way. Because once the unconscious is activated, it does not wait for permission. It does not ask for clarity. It simply continues unfolding in the background, shaping thoughts, emotions, and reactions in ways that feel automatic and difficult to stop. Most people misunderstand what obsession actually looks like. They assume it is always loud, obvious, and extreme. Constant messages, desperate chasing, visible emotional breakdowns. But real obsession is often much quieter than that. It hides behind control, behind silence, behind overthinking. Because the stronger the feeling becomes, the more the conscious mind tries to suppress it. And suppression does not remove emotion. It intensifies it. It pushes it deeper, where it continues to grow without interruption. So what happens next is not always visible. Instead, it becomes mental repetition. They analyze you. They replay conversations in their mind. They return to moments that felt emotionally charged and keep reinterpreting them again and again. Not because they choose to, but because their mind cannot stop itself from doing it. You become attached to something unresolved inside them, something unfinished. And unfinished emotional patterns are some of the strongest forces that influence human behavior, even when a person believes they are in control. But what you may not realize is that the intensity they feel is not only about you as a person. It is also about what you represent internally within them. In unconscious language, people rarely attach themselves only to individuals. Instead, they attach to symbols. And you have become a symbol of something that carries emotional weight. You may represent something they lost, something they never experienced, or something they were conditioned to believe they could never have. And this symbolic layer is what makes the attachment so powerful. This is where contradiction begins to form inside them. One part of them feels drawn closer, while another part instinctively pulls away. It is not because they do not care, but because caring itself opens emotional doors they have spent a long time keeping closed. And when those doors begin to open, internal conflict becomes unavoidable. The mind tries to protect itself by resisting, even while the emotional system continues to move toward connection. This is what creates instability in their behavior, and you can feel it, even if nothing is directly explained. The inconsistency, the emotional pull followed by distance, the sense that something is always happening beneath the surface even when everything appears calm. But the truth is, they are not confused about you as much as they are overwhelmed by themselves. Because what you activated in them does not operate on logic. It operates on emotion, memory, and suppressed desire. It reacts to things the conscious mind has long ignored or pushed away. And once that deeper part becomes active, it begins asking questions that do not have easy answers. Why does this feel so familiar? Why does this feel frightening and comforting at the same time? Why do I want this, but also feel the need to run from it? These questions create internal splitting, not in a visible or dramatic way, but in a quiet psychological tension between two opposing needs. One part seeks control and stability, while the other seeks release and emotional resolution. Because resolution is never comfortable at first, it often creates emotional chaos before it creates clarity. So instead of facing it, they create distance. They tell themselves that space will help. That time will reduce the intensity. That separation will weaken the emotional pull. But in reality, distance does not erase unconscious attachment. It often strengthens it. Because when reality is removed, imagination takes its place. And imagination is where emotional fixation grows the strongest. At this point, what they feel is no longer just emotional reaction. It becomes internal imagery, projection, and symbolic attachment. You are no longer experienced only as a person in their external world. You exist inside their internal world as well, shaped by interpretation, memory, and emotional meaning. And this internal version of you often becomes stronger over time than the real external version. That is what makes the attachment so difficult to break. And yet, they do not fully trust what they feel. They do not trust how quickly it formed or how strongly it affects them. They sense that anything this intense must carry consequences, even if they cannot define what those consequences are. So resistance begins to form. Doubt appears. Fear enters. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because accepting it fully would require them to face everything they have avoided within themselves. If they were to fully accept what they feel, they would have to confront suppressed emotions, unresolved inner wounds, and truths they have been avoiding for a long time. And that is not something the mind allows easily. So they remain in an in-between state, pulled toward you, yet resisting you, thinking of you, yet avoiding clarity, feeling deeply, yet expressing very little. And over time, this creates pressure that does not disappear on its own. Because the human mind cannot carry contradiction forever without consequence, something eventually has to shift. It may come as emotional release, withdrawal, or behavior that looks confusing, even self-destructive. When unconscious emotion becomes stronger than conscious control, Logic slowly loses its influence, and the internal balance begins to collapse. That is the point where the illusion of control starts to break, where what was being avoided can no longer stay hidden, and where the feeling can no longer be treated as something temporary, because it has already grown into something deeper within them. And this is where the pressure becomes unavoidable. What they are experiencing is no longer simple attraction or curiosity. It becomes inner confrontation with parts of themselves they have avoided for years. Old emotional wounds, rejection, and beliefs of not being enough rise again because they were never fully processed, only buried. Your presence, without intention, brings them back into awareness. And because the mind resists contradiction, it begins to split instead of integrate. One part moves toward you through connection and emotional recognition, while another part pulls away, overwhelmed by exposure and internal instability. The closer they feel to you, the more exposed they feel within themselves, until it stops feeling like normal emotion and starts feeling like emotional threat. At this stage, you are no longer just someone they are drawn to. You become something that challenges their internal structure. So their defenses respond through silence, withdrawal, or confusion they cannot explain. To survive the intensity, they start creating explanations like maybe it is not real, or maybe it is just in my head, but this is not true understanding. It is containment, because accepting it fully would mean admitting how deep and real it actually is. Even as they try to rationalize it, emotion does not obey logic. The subconscious does not negotiate. The pull toward you remains, steady and quiet, turning into restlessness, tension, and a feeling that something is missing even when everything seems normal on the surface. Without realizing it, you become tied to that internal feeling in them, because their mind links you to something unresolved. This creates a cycle that keeps intensifying: brief closeness, almost vulnerability, almost expression, followed immediately by withdrawal. Not just fear of losing you, but fear of how deeply they are emotionally involved. And over time, this cycle strengthens itself until they are caught between desire and fear, connection and avoidance, unable to fully explain what is happening inside them. What makes it more complex is that this is not only emotional tension, it is identity tension. Moving toward you means becoming someone more open, more vulnerable, more emotionally exposed, and that version of themselves feels unfamiliar and unstable. But moving away does not end the feeling either. It stays, quietly turning into longing, regret, and questions they cannot resolve. What if this was real? What if I lost something I cannot replace? And that realization removes every sense of safety, leaving only different forms of emotional loss. At that point, you are no longer just part of their emotional experience. You become a turning point in their inner world, a disruption in their identity, something they cannot fully unsee again. In the end, what they feel is not something that can stay in a constant state of tension forever. Every emotional experience that becomes too heavy eventually reaches a point where it has to settle into some form of clarity, acceptance, or distance. When someone is pulled between intensity and fear for too long, the mind naturally begins to seek resolution, even if that process is uncomfortable or slow. What starts as confusion often turns into reflection, and what feels overwhelming eventually forces understanding in some form, whether through awareness or through time. And when everything quiets down, what remains is not just the feeling itself, but what it revealed about them. Their reactions, their distance, their closeness, and their internal conflict all point back to something deeper within their own emotional world. In the end, every strong emotional experience becomes a mirror, showing them parts of themselves they may not have fully understood before. And whether they move forward, step back, or pause in between, the impact of that experience stays with them as something that shaped their inner awareness.